Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Machiavelli's Discourses. We're continuing our examination of Book 2, looking at Chapter 19 today. So, 19 over there. So let's turn to it. And this is about acquisitions, right? The acquisitions by republics that are not well ordered and that do not proceed according to the Roman virtue are for the ruins, not the exaltation. In other words, he's going to be saying that if you're not a well-ordered republic and you don't proceed according to the Roman way of doing virtue, the Roman virtue, these republics will be ruined, not their exaltation, not their greatness. These opinions, contrary to the truth, found on bad examples, that have been introduced by these corrupt centuries of ours, keep men thinking or deviating from accustomed modes. In other words, opinions contrary to the truth, found on bad examples, introduced in our corrupt century of ours, right? Men keep thinking of deviating from accustomed modes, keep on innovating, making new things. When would one have been able to persuade, in other words, when one would have been able to persuade an Italian up to 30 years ago that 10,000 infantrymen could assault 10,000 horse and as many infantry in the plain, and not only combat but defeat them, as was shown by the example cited above us at Novara. When could we persuade that? Right. This is Discourses 2:17 and 18:14. Right. This Battle of Novara, in that sense. How when would one been able to persuade Italians up to 30 years ago that was possible? Right. And although the histories may be full of it, they still would not have lent it their faith. Now, this is about, in other words, this is more, his point here is that they wouldn't believe it. Even if they knew about the past history, the record examples of the ancients, and they even they knew the reality of the thing, they still would not believe that it was possible, right? They would not have lent it the faith that infantry, in other words, that 10,000 infantry could assail 10,000 horse and as many infantry in the plain, and not only combat them but defeat them. Right? Not possible. They don't believe it. And if they had lent it their faith, they would have said that in these times, one is even if they lent it, they believed it, right? It was possible. They would have said that in these times, one is better armed, and that the squadron of men of arms would be capable of charging a cliff and not merely infantry. And thus they corrupted their judgments with false excuses. In other words, these infantrymen would have been good. Well, that's because their arms were so good they could have even defeated a cliff, right? No. In other words, nor would they have considered that Lucullus, with a few infantry, broke 150,000 horse of Tingares, and that among those cavalrymen were a sort of cavalry together similar to our men at arms. Right. This is example of this is that in Plutarch Lucullus, right, that he defeated it with our men at arms. The cavalry was like our men of arms, and therefore they defeated them. And thus, as this fallacy has been uncovered by the example of the ultramontane troops, and as it is seen by it that all that is narrated about infantry in the histories is true, they ought to believe all the other ancient orders to be true and useful. Again, following in Deleuze, we detach this clause of this sentence from the previous one sentence and attach it here. In other words, they moved it around. They moved this from where it was from up here, right? In other words, this fallacy should have been In other words, even the examples of this truth should have led people to realize that not only is this true, that infantry better, then also the other ancient orders of Roman virtue is true and useful. And if this were believed, republics and princes would err less, would be stronger in opposing a thrust that might come against them, and would not put their hopes in flight. And those who have in their hands a civil way of life would know better how to direct it, either by way of expanding it or by a way of maintaining it. In other words, he's saying he's not only they believe in the infantry and the virtue, they would not emphasize retreating or flying away. And if they understood that, they would also regard the ancient princes that would err less and be stronger in opposing thrusts that might come against them. But also they would direct in their hands a civil way of life, right, to know better how to direct it, keeping, expanding, and maintaining it. And they would believe that increasing the inhabitants of one city, getting partners and not subjects, sending colonies to guard countries that have been acquired, making capital out of booty, subduing the enemy with raids and battles, and not with sieges, keeping the public rich and the private poor, and maintaining military exercises with the highest seriousness is the true way to make a republic great and to acquire empire. In other words, he lists a whole series of things. In other words, he believes that if you understood this, the Roman example, you do what? How you do this? You what? Increase the size of your city. Gain partners, not subjects. Send colonies to guard countries that have been acquired. Making capital out of the booty, right? Subduing the enemy with raids and battles, not with sieges. Keeping the public rich and the private, powerful people poor. And maintaining military exercises with the seriousness that was a way to make this empire. And if this mode of expanding does not please them, one should think that acquisitions made in any other way are the ruins of republics. And one should put a check on every ambition. In other words, regulate one city inside with laws and customs and prohibit acquisition. In other words, if you're not going to proceed this way, what he's saying that here, this is, in other words, then if this mode is expanding does not please them, then one should think that acquisitions made by other ways are ruinous and should check every ambition. Regulate one city inside with laws and customs, prohibit acquisitions, and think only of defending oneself and keeping one's defenses well ordered, as do the republics of Germany, which live and have lived freely in these modes for a time. So again, the German example is what? They're not expanding. The cities, the various free states, the free cities, and these things are maintain them. They're not acquiring new things. They maintain their orders and maintain their discipline, right? So if the German example is not acquiring, but of maintaining and preserving. Nevertheless, as I have said in another point, when I discouraged the difference, when I discoursed of the differences there were between ordering to acquire and ordering to maintain, it is impossible for a republic to succeed in staying quiet and enjoying its freedom in little borders. In other words, again, this is discourse. I think it's 2:16, chapter 16, right? In other words, it's going to be difficult for them to a republic, impossible for a republic to succeed in maintaining quiet and enjoying its freedom in little borders. For if it will not molest others, it will be molested. And from being molested, will arise the wish and the necessity to acquire. And if it does not have an enemy outside, it will find one at home, as it appears necessary happens to all great cities. So in other words, okay, if you're going to be a good republic, a great republic, right, and you stay quiet, it's going to be very difficult. It's impossible to succeed in staying quiet and enjoying its freedom. Why? Because if it will not molest others, it will be molested. Its bounty and its bounty and its attractiveness would lead others to molest it. And therefore, if you're not going to start doing it to do others, they're going to do it to you. And from being molested arises the wish that in the necessity to acquire, right, then you have to do this, right? And it does not have to be the enemy outside. It will find one at home. They will start attacking each other like this. It appears a necessity happens to all great cities. And if the republics of Germany can live in that mode and have been able to endure for a time, it arises from a certain conditions in that country that are not elsewhere, without which they could not keep a way of life, a mode of life, keep a like mode of life. In other words, the Germans, there's something unique about the Germans here. Again, this is the German, this is the, in other words, the examples of Germany's are unique to the realities of the Germans, and not necessarily something that's universally true. He's talking about his idea of republics, in that this seems to be the more general rule, but the German example kind of gives an alternative. But the problem with the German example is just very specifically unique to that. Now he's going to talk about this here. The part of Germany which I speak was subject to the Roman Empire, as were France and Spain. But when so that was the western part of Germany, right? That part of Germany which I speak was subject to the Roman Empire, as were France and Spain. But when it came into decline, and its title of empire was reduced in that province, in other words, the title to empire was reduced in that province, right? Those areas. The more powerful of these cities, to make themselves free, began buying themselves off from the empire by reserving to it a small annual payment, according to the cowardice or necessity of the emperor, so that little by little all those cities that were direct under the emperor were not subject to any prince, bought themselves off in a like mode. In other words, that they bought the emperor off. The emperor became weak, not able to do it. So little by little, all those cities that were directly under the emperor and not subject to any prince, right, bought themselves off. They paid for their. The prince was not willing to. The emperor wasn't willing to go there and do things. In the same time that these cities bought themselves off, it occurred that certain communities subject to the Duke of Austria rebelled against him, among which were the Freiburg and the Swiss, and the like. Prospering in the beginning, they little by little achieved so much increase that they not only did not return under the yoke of Austria, but put all the neighbors in fear. They are those who are called the Swiss. Thus, this province was divided into the Swiss republics, whom they call free towns. Princes. So this divided into the Swiss republics. This Germany. The Germans are Swiss republics, so they call free towns. Princes and emperor. And the cause of why they do not arise, and the cause why wars do not arise among so much diversity of ways of life, or if they arise, they do not long endure, is the sign of the emperor whom should he happen not to have forces, nevertheless has so much reputation among them that he is the conciliator for them, and eliminates every scandal and with his authority by imposing himself as the mediator. So he's exampling the emperor. This is more interesting. In other words, he moves. This is the problem. This is what emperor is he talking about? Is he talking about the Roman emperor in the traditional sense, or now is he talking? When is he talking about? About the Holy Roman Empire? This is why it's confusing here. It almost sounds like he was talking about the ancient Romans, but no, it may be talking about the Holy Roman Empire, right? That the emperor is never that powerful in this stuff. Now, caveat must be saying here, the 30-Year War has not been happened yet, so the 30-Year War, Machiavelli does not know about, would not experience 30-Year War. The 30-Year War will be the worst war in all German history. How much destruction and wrath it will release. So, look, he's Machiavelli. See, everything Machiavelli says here has to be said with a caveat for the Germans. This is true at his time. But they have not had a war, and they were able to. The emperor was able to maintain and to do as an advocate in that sense, right, as a mediator. The great and longer wars that have been there are those that have occurred between the Swiss and the Duke of Austria. And although for many years the emperor and the Duke of Austria have been one and the same thing, he has not, therefore, ever been able to overcome the audacity of the Swiss, with whom there has never been any mode of accord unless by force. So therefore, in other words, the German free cities, right, they're bought off and they still accommodate to the emperor. The Swiss are totally free and only be addressed by force, right, coercion and so. Nor has the rest of Germany brought him much aid, the emperor in that sense, both because the communities do not know how to make offense against whomever wishes to live freely like them, and because these princes partly cannot, because they are poor, and partly will not because they're envious of his power, right? These are the reasons why there's never going to be a real challenge to this. These communities can thus live content with their small dominions because thanks. No, this is 5. Thanks. Respect, right? This is. Thanks to the imperial authority, they do not have cause to desire more, right? Because in other words, the imperial authority limits them. They don't want to have that much power. They want to take it over, and they see the limits of it, right? They can live united inside their walls because they have nearby the enemy who would take the opportunity to seize them whenever they should be in discord. So therefore they don't go in discord because they have an outside force that would take advantage of them there in discourse. If that province were in other conditions, it would suit them to seek to expand and break their quiet. In other words, they're in a situation where they're free, and their outside enemy keeps them being unchecked, and therefore they maintain their things, and they don't want to grow too big, right? But if they were other conditions, they would grow big. Since there are no such conditions elsewhere, one cannot take this mode of life and needs either to expand by way of leagues or to expand like the Romans. In other words, the German cities and the way that things are, and the example of that example that he gives shows that it's extraordinary. It has certain unique qualities that preserve that situation, and that if given that other places don't require like this, You have to either, expand by way of leagues or expand like the Romans did. Okay? Whomever governs himself otherwise seeks not his life but his death and ruin. For in 1,000 modes and from many causes his acquisitions are harmful. In other words, if you don't follow this, for example, by leagues or the Romans or strategy, you got to be careful. Those who govern themselves otherwise seeks not his life but his death. For in 1,000 modes and from many causes his acquisitions are harmful. For he will likely acquire empire without forces. And whoever acquires empire without forces will be fittingly ruined. So if you don't have the resources to maintain your empire, if you get it, then you don't have the forces to do it, so therefore will be ruined. Whomever impoverishes himself through wars cannot acquire forces. So if you're going to make yourself poor because of wars, you're not going to have the ability to acquire forces. Even should he be victorious, since he spends more than he obtains from the acquisitions, as the Venetians and the Florentines have done, who have been much weaker when they had Lombardy and the other Tuscany, and they were when one was content with the sea and the other with 6 miles of border. So therefore, in other words, the Venetians with Lombardy, if they just in other words, they had the sea, they could have kept the sea, they would have been richer, more habitant. But they conquered Lombardy, and therefore they were just undone them. And then the Florentines, well, they would have been better with the border, 6 mile border with the Tuscans, right? For all arose from their having wished to acquire, and not having known how to take up the mode to do so. In other words, they wanted to acquire, but didn't have the right means to do so, the right mode to do so, the way of doing so. In other words, they deserve more blame inasmuch as they have less excuse, since they saw the mode the Romans took and could have followed their examples, while the Romans, without any example, by their own prudence, knew how to find it by themselves. So the Romans only exercised by their prudence. These guys deserve more blame because why? They had the examples of the Romans and chose not to do it. So even if they didn't have the prudence to do it on their own, they didn't have the good judgment to follow the example, know that the Roman example was better for them. Right? And therefore they deserve more blame than that. Besides this, acquisitions sometimes do no middling harm. In other words, besides this, acquisitions sometimes do no middling harm to every well-ordered republic. In other words, acquisitions do no middling harm to nobody. When it acquires a city or a province full of delights, luxuries, right, whereby it can take their customs through the intercourse, conversations, talks, it had with them, as happened first to Rome and then to Hannibal in the acquisition of Caputa. Livy 7:38 and then 3:18. If Caputa had been more distant from the city, so that the remedy for this error of the soldiers would not have been, in other words, if Caputa has been more distant from the city, so that the remedy for the error of the soldiers would not have been nearby, or if Rome had been corrupt in some part, without doubt the acquisition would have been the ruin of the Roman Republic. Okay, right? In other words, this is the problem, right? This is the Rome. If in other words, Rome was nearby, and therefore they correct the problem of the soldiers getting corrupted. Titus Livy vouches for this with these words. Even then, the least wholesome of military discipline, Caputa, with its means for every pleasure, diverted and charmed the spirits of the soldiers from the memory of their fatherland, right? In other words, again, this is quoted in Latin, Livy 7:38. In other words, this is the danger of this. This is like, oh my God. And truly, similar cities or provinces avenge themselves against their conquering without fighting and without blood. For by permeating it with their bad customs, they expose it to being conquered by whoever assaults it, right? This is the problem. This is an example of a place. You get it, and because of its customs, habits, its luxuries, and its excesses, in other words, Rome was able to maintain, because Rome was close and they discipline order, they can change soldiers and like this. But if it wasn't, if it was not nearby, or if Rome had been corrupt in some part, this would have been the destruction of a republic. And it's truly very similar cities or provinces avenge themselves in this way, right? He says they corrupt the things. And this is the famous examples of what happened. Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws talk about the Mongols when they captured the Chinese. Well, the Mongols conquer China, but what they do is they adapted that way of life of the conquered people, and they become servile. And this destroyed the Mongols ever since. Okay, the conquest can destroy you as much as help you if you're not the right kind of people, the right kind of virtue. Juvenal in his satires could not have better considered this part, saying that though the acquisition of foreign lands, foreign customs entered Roman breasts, and in the exchange for thrift and the other excellent virtues, gluttony, luxury, have made their homes and avenged the conquered world, right? This is, again, a 10 quoted in Latin Juvenal satires, and except that Machiavelli adds gluttony, right? In other words, luxury. In other words, Juvenal only talks about luxury have made their homes and avenged this, right? Machiavelli adds the word gluttony to his into Juvenal. In other words, vengeance. The satire of this shows how even conquering the bad habits comes and corrupts. If acquiring was thus about to be, to be pernicious for the Romans, in the times when they proceeded with so much prudence and so much virtue, what would it be for those who proceeded so distantly from their modes, and who availed themselves of either mercenaries or auxiliary soldiers, beside the other errors they make, which are much discoursed above, right? In other words, if the Romans risked this, whereas he's saying that the Romans even suffered getting the vices of in other words, getting corrupted by the mores and habits of the people the things they acquire. If that people were able to, what about us who are not as prudent, who don't, in other words, who don't proceed by their modes? That we're going to get worse. From this, the harms that will be mentioned in the following chapter will often result for them. In other words, his next chapter is going to talk about the dangers of what happens. Okay, we're going to stop here. Put your comments in the comments or questions or things about the chapter. Put them below, and I'll respond to them when I see them. If you like the chapter, hit the like button. It helps the algorithm in that sense. If you really liked it, share it with your friends, share it on social media, share it far and wide. And if you've not subscribed, please consider subscribing. Encourage others to check out the channel. Check out the other videos we did in Machiavelli and other things. Another thing you do is you can, like I said, commenting, liking, subscribing, sharing, all these things help the algorithm, so people in searching things you will get more attention in that sense. People find these things. Another thing you do is you could Didn't like it? Okay, you can thumbs down, but say why in the comments so people can benefit from this, okay? Another thing you can do is you can follow me on social media, links below. You want to know more about me as a scholar and academic, check out the academic social media links below the social media links, where you can also check out my public academic publications and things like that. Another thing you do is you can help me, want to help those who want to help. You can do so through Patreon or Subscribestar. Or another way you can help is by buy one of my books, which are listed below, and you can order it through of course, your local bookstore might have it, who knows, but order through an online distributor like a Barnes & Noble or Amazon or Libris, or order directly through the publishers. And you can even do so through the ebook that's available, on Kindle and Amazon and other things. Well, therefore, that's it. We'll see you next in chapter 20. Take care and have a good day. Bye-bye.